I used to laugh at stories like this. You hear them all the time, don't you? Whispers about places no one talks about openly. A house, a forest, or maybe an old building where things happened. The kind of stories that always start the same way. They say no one's been there in years. Or people who go in don't come out. I'd always roll my eyes, brush it off. Urban legends. Tall tales to scare kids, to keep them from exploring places they shouldn't. I thought that's all they were. Until the night I decided to see for myself. It started as a joke, really. The abandoned military base out in the swamps of Florida. Just a crumbling shell of concrete and steel, hidden by overgrowth, forgotten by everyone. Everyone, except for the people who knew its story. The rumors. The base was built during the Cold War, or so the records say. Officially, it was for research, training, routine operations. But unofficially, that's where things get murky. Locals talked about experiments, ones that didn't make it into the official reports. There were whispers about human trials, soldiers who vanished, and strange, unexplained lights in the sky. The government shut it down in the 1970s, sealed it off, but they didn't explain why. And over time, the questions faded. People moved on. Except, not everyone did. I'd heard the rumors growing up. Everyone in town had. Some people claimed they'd gone out there, dared by friends, or just looking for a thrill. Most of them came back with nothing to say. Others didn't come back at all. And the ones who did come back, they wouldn't talk about it. Not really. They'd just say the same thing, over and over again. You don't want to go there. But I didn't believe them. I thought they were just stories, exaggerations. I mean, how bad could it really be? So one night, a group of us decided to go. Just for fun, we said. Just to see what it was like. We packed flashlights, cameras, water. We told ourselves we were prepared, that it was all just an adventure. Nothing to be afraid of. And at first it was. The drive out there took hours. The closer we got, the more isolated it felt. The roads narrowed, the trees thickened, the air got heavier. By the time we arrived, it was past midnight. The sky was pitch black, no moon, no stars. Just the sound of insects and the distant rustle of leaves in the wind. The gate was still standing, rusted, half covered in vines, but standing. We pushed it open, and the sound it made, I'll never forget it. A low, groaning creak that echoed into the dark, as if we'd woken something up. That's when I first felt it, that weight in the air. Like the place didn't want us there, but we went in anyway. The base was massive, overgrown, decayed, but still imposing. Buildings loomed in the shadows, their windows broken, their walls covered in graffiti and grime. The ground was littered with debris, rusted metal, shattered glass, old papers that crumbled at the slightest touch. It smelled like mildew and rust, with something else underneath, something sharp, metallic, almost like blood. At first, it was just unsettling. The silence, the stillness. Every step we took echoed too loudly. Like the place was amplifying our movements, making sure we knew we were being heard. We laughed to break the tension, made stupid jokes about ghosts and conspiracies. But the laughter didn't last long. It started with the sounds. Faint, almost imperceptible. A soft tapping, like fingers drumming on metal. Then a whisper. Too low to make out, but unmistakable. We told ourselves it was the wind, the building settling, anything but what it felt like. Someone or something watching us. The deeper we went, the worse it got. The air got colder even though it was the middle of summer. Our flashlights seemed dimmer, their beams swallowed up by the dark. And then there were the shadows. At first, they were just tricks of the light, or at least that's what we told ourselves. But they didn't move the way shadows should. They were too fast, too deliberate. We found things, strange things, old equipment, rusted and broken, but still recognizable. Monitors, chairs with restraints, tanks of some kind, their glass shattered, and the walls were covered in scratches. Symbols, words, all carved deep into the concrete. Some of them we couldn't read. Others we wished we hadn't. Don't stay, it watches. Help me. That's when we started to feel it. That pressure in the air, like the building was alive, breathing, watching. Every step felt heavier, every sound sharper. And the further we went, the more it felt like we weren't alone. I remember one moment vividly. We were standing in a hallway, the light from our flashlights bouncing off the cracked tiles, and then from somewhere ahead we heard it. A voice. Faint, distant, but unmistakable. It said my name. I should have turned back then. I should have left, but I didn't. And what happened next, I still can't explain, and I'm not sure I ever will. To understand why I went there, why I even thought stepping foot inside that place was a good idea, you have to understand who I was back then. I was someone who liked answers, someone who thought they could handle the truth, no matter how strange or unsettling. It wasn't just curiosity. It was something deeper. I grew up hearing the stories, the warnings. Everyone did, but I didn't believe them. The base, officially known as Site Echo, was a military facility tucked away in the heart of the Florida swamps. It was hard to get to, almost impossible without a map or the right coordinates. But that only made it more intriguing. On paper, it was just another Cold War installation, a place for research and testing. Nothing special. But the stories, those were harder to ignore. They said strange things happened there, even before it was abandoned. Soldiers disappearing without explanation, lights flickering in patterns that didn't make sense, a hum, low and steady, that could be heard from miles away on quiet nights. And then, the most chilling story of all, the night the base went silent. It was in the late 1960s, at the height of the Cold War. According to local accounts, one evening, all communications from Site Echo stopped. No distress calls, no warnings, just nothing. When a recovery team finally arrived days later, they found the place completely deserted. Equipment was still running, lights were still on, meals were left half-eaten on trays, but there wasn't a single person to be found. No signs of a struggle, no bodies, just gone. The government called it a routine evacuation due to a containment breach, but that explanation never sat right with anyone, especially not the locals who lived nearby. They swore they could hear screams coming from the base at night. They said that even now, decades later, people who went too close came back changed, if they came back at all. These were the kinds of stories I grew up with, told in hushed voices around campfires or during late-night hangouts. And for most people, that was enough. They were scary, sure, but they were just stories. No one needed to prove them right or wrong. But me, I wasn't like most people. I wanted to know. It started as a casual idea, something my friends and I joked about. We were sitting around one night, bored, scrolling through old forums and urban exploration sites. Someone mentioned Site Echo, and before long, we were all deep in a rabbit hole of conspiracy theories, grainy photos, and cryptic comments from anonymous users. "We should go," someone said. I laughed at first. Yeah, right. But the more we talked about it, the more it seemed possible. Why not? We had cars, flashlights, cameras. We'd done smaller explorations before, old factories, crumbling mansions, places like that. What was one more abandoned building? And besides, it wasn't like we were the only ones interested. There were enough online posts and videos about Site Echo to prove that other people had been there. If they could do it, so could we. So we picked a night. It was early spring, the kind of cool, foggy evening that makes everything feel a little more mysterious. Perfect weather for an adventure, or so we thought. There were 4 of us, me of course, along with Danny, Mia, and Will. We were all close, the kind of friends who do just about anything for a good story to tell later. We packed our gear, flashlights, extra batteries, snacks, water, a first aid kit. Will even brought his GoPro to document the whole thing. We didn't say it out loud, but we all wanted proof. Proof that we'd been there, that we'd seen whatever it was people were so afraid of. The drive out to the base took hours. It was farther out than we expected, hidden deep in the swamp, surrounded by towering trees and thick underbrush. The road narrowed the closer we got, until it was barely more than a dirt path. The air smelled damp and earthy, and the fog clung to the ground like a living thing, swirling around the tires as we drove. When we finally saw the gates, it was like stepping into another world. The chain-link fence was rusted and twisted, sagging under the weight of vines and moss. Beyond it, the base loomed, hulking, shadowy shapes against the foggy night. The buildings were half sunken into the earth, their walls cracked and crumbling. Some of them were almost completely overgrown, swallowed by the swamp. It was silent, oppressively so. No insects, no rustling leaves, just the faint sound of our own breathing and the crunch of gravel under our boots. Even the air felt heavy, thick with humidity and something else I couldn't name. As we stood there, staring at the base, I felt a flicker of doubt. This place wasn't like the others we'd explored. It felt different, not just because of the stories, but because of the way it made me feel. Uneasy, like we were being watched. I shook it off. "Ready?" I asked, forcing a grin. Danny nodded, though his face was pale. Mia rolled her eyes, always the skeptic, and Will was already setting up his camera. None of us said what we were all thinking, that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't a good idea, but it was too late to turn back. The gates groaned as we pushed them open, the sound cutting through the stillness like a scream. The rusted metal scraped against the ground, and for a moment none of us moved. It wasn't just the sound, it was the feeling. Like we'd just crossed a line, stepped over some invisible boundary. I didn't say it, but I knew the others felt it too. Once we were inside, the first thing that hit me was the smell. Damp and metallic, with an underlying sourness that made me want to gag. It was the kind of smell that stuck in the back of your throat, that made you feel like you were breathing in something you shouldn't. The buildings were even more imposing up close. Huge concrete structures, their walls streaked with black and green from years of rain and moss. Most of the windows were broken, the shards glinting faintly in the light from our flashlights. The graffiti was everywhere, bright, chaotic splashes of color that somehow made the place feel even more desolate. Underfoot, the ground was uneven, covered in dirt, broken glass, and bits of twisted metal. Every step we took echoed in the silence, making it impossible to forget just how empty the place was. And yet it didn't feel empty. We started with the main building, what looked like an old administrative office. The door hung crookedly on its hinges, and we had to squeeze through the gap to get inside. The air inside was colder than it should have been, and it carried that same metallic tang, sharper now, almost overwhelming. The first room was exactly what you'd expect from a place like this. Desks overturned, papers scattered, a few broken chairs. But it was the details that got to me. The documents, yellowed with age, were still legible in places. Diagrams of brains, charts tracking heart rates and breathing patterns, notes scribbled in the margins. One phrase kept appearing: sensory deprivation, extended trials. Then there was the equipment. Old, rusted machines with wires dangling like veins, their purposes unclear but unmistakably unsettling. One of the monitors still had a faint outline of something burned into the screen, a ghostly afterimage of a human face. As we moved further in, the unease grew. The cold draft hit us first, sharp and sudden, even though the windows were boarded up and there was no breeze outside. It was the kind of cold that sinks into your bones, that makes your skin prickle and your breath catch. In one room, we found a chair, just a simple, metal chair, sitting perfectly in the center of the space. There was nothing else in the room, no papers, no machines, no signs that anyone had been there in years. Just the chair, positioned like someone had been sitting there, waiting for something. "Why is it like that?" Danny asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. No one answered. The smell got worse as we went deeper. It was metallic, yes, but now there was something else mixed in. Something sour, putrid, like rotting meat. It came in waves, stronger in some areas, almost gone in others, as if whatever was causing it was moving. And then there were the sounds. At first, it was just the echo of our footsteps, too loud against the silence. But after a while, there was something else. Faint, barely audible. Footsteps. Not ours. They seemed to come from just ahead or just behind us, always stopping the moment we paused to listen. We tried to laugh it off. Probably just the sound carrying weird in here, Mia said, but her face was pale and her hands shook as she adjusted her flashlight. It was Will who saw it first. We were in one of the hallways, long and narrow, with doors lining either side. Most of the doors were closed, their handles rusted and broken. But at the far end there was one that was slightly ajar, its edges barely illuminated by Will's camera light. "I saw something," he said suddenly, his voice sharp. "What?" I asked, my heart pounding. "A figure, right there." He pointed to the open door. We all looked, our flashlights converging on the spot. But there was nothing there. Just the open doorway, leading into another room. "It was there," Will insisted. "I swear." None of us argued, but none of us wanted to go look either. And then we found the diary. It was in a drawer in what looked like an old lab. The drawer was stuck, warped by time and damp, but Danny managed to pry it open. Inside, among the papers and bits of broken glass, was a small, leather-bound notebook. The cover was worn, the edges frayed, but the pages inside were remarkably intact. The first entries were dated in the late 1960s, written in a neat, careful hand. They talked about experiments, observations, technical details we didn't understand. But the later entries were different. The handwriting was messier, frantic. The dates didn't make sense. They were from the 1980s, years after the base was supposed to have been abandoned. And the entries themselves, they were worse. "They're in the walls, watching, waiting. I can't sleep anymore. Every time I close my eyes, I see them, I hear them. The lights, they don't work right. They blink when it's near. I think it knows I can see it. I shouldn't have come down here. None of us should have. It wasn't worth it. None of it was worth it." The last entry was barely legible, the words scratched into the paper like the writer had been shaking. "If you're reading this, get out. Don't look for them. Don't stay. Just leave." The air around us felt heavier as we read. No one spoke. No one moved. And then, from somewhere down the hallway, we heard it, a single, deliberate knock, and then another, and then silence. We should have left after the diary. Any reasonable person would have, but we weren't thinking clearly anymore. Not really. The silence that followed those knocks hung over us like a heavy fog, making it hard to think, hard to breathe. But we didn't leave. Instead, we did the opposite. We went deeper. The stairs leading down to the underground bunker were narrow and steep, their metal edges slick with condensation. The air was even colder here, damp and stale, like it hadn't been disturbed in decades. Each step echoed hollowly, the sound bouncing off unseen walls and fading into the darkness below. By the time we reached the bottom, the beam of my flashlight felt useless, swallowed up by the oppressive blackness. But what little it did illuminate was enough to make my stomach churn. The room, if you could call it that, was cavernous, the walls reinforced with steel panels. And everywhere I looked, there were signs of something. Chairs with leather restraints bolted to the floor, long tables lined with rusted tools that looked more like instruments of torture than anything else. The walls were scratched, gouged deeply in places, the marks forming jagged symbols that made my skin crawl. What the hell is this?" Mia whispered, her voice trembling. None of us answered. The whispers started then, faint at first, almost too soft to hear, like the sound of wind moving through cracks. But as we moved further in, they grew louder. Words we couldn't understand, spoken in voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. "Do you hear that?" Will asked, his voice barely above a whisper. We all nodded, and then Danny screamed. It was sudden, sharp, and raw, a sound that made my heart leap into my throat. He spun around, his flashlight beam shaking wildly as he clutched at his shoulder. "Something touched me," he gasped, his face pale, his eyes wide with terror. "What are you talking about?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm telling you, something grabbed me." He held up his flashlight, shining it on his shoulder. There were no marks, no signs of anything, but his panic was infectious. We huddled closer together after that, our flashlights sweeping the room in frantic, overlapping arcs. That's when we saw the door. It was massive, easily twice the size of any other door we'd seen in the base, made of thick steel and covered in faded warnings. The largest one, painted in bold red letters, read, "Do not open." "Maybe we should turn back," Mia said, her voice wavering. But Will was already moving toward it, his GoPro still recording. "We didn't come this far to stop now," he said. Against our better judgment, we followed him. The door was heavy, the metal groaning in protest as we pushed it open. The air inside was colder than ever, biting at our skin like a living thing. At first it seemed empty, just another room, bare and lifeless. But then my flashlight caught something in the corner. A projector. It clicked to life as we stepped inside, the film reel spinning noisily, casting distorted images onto the far wall. The footage was old, grainy, and disjointed, showing people sitting in chairs like the ones we'd seen outside. They stared directly at the camera, their faces blank, their eyes unblinking. And then the images started to shift. The faces changed, becoming warped, unnatural. Their mouths opened in silent screams. Their eyes darkened until they were nothing but black voids. "Turn it off," Mia whispered, her voice trembling. Will moved to the projector, but before he could touch it, the light from the reel flickered, casting shadows that seemed to move on their own. One of them detached itself from the wall, shifting, solidifying. It was tall, impossibly tall, and its shape was wrong. It didn't walk. It glided, silent and deliberate, moving toward us with a fluidity that made my stomach churn. "Run," I said, though my voice came out as little more than a croak. The shadow figure stopped abruptly, vanishing before it reached us. But the silence it left behind was deafening, oppressive. And then the lights flickered violently, plunging us into total darkness before flaring back to life. That's when the screech started. It wasn't like any sound I'd ever heard before. High-pitched, metallic, and so loud it felt like it was drilling into my skull. We bolted, the noise driving us forward, our flashlights bobbing wildly as we ran. We didn't realize Danny wasn't with us until we reached the stairs. "Where's Danny?" Mia asked, her voice breaking. We froze, turning back toward the darkness. That's when we heard it. His voice, faint and distorted, calling for help. "Guys, I'm here!" It was coming from deeper inside, from the direction we'd just fled. "We have to go back," Will said, but his voice was shaking. "No," Mia snapped. "That's not him." "What are you talking about?" Will demanded. "Listen to it," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. And then I heard it too. Danny's voice wasn't right. It echoed strangely, overlapping itself, like it was coming from multiple directions at once. "Guys, come back! I'm right here!" It was closer now, but the way it moved, it wasn't human. "We have to go," I said, grabbing Will's arm. But now, we didn't look back. We didn't stop running. The screeching sound followed us all the way up the stairs, growing louder, more unbearable, until we burst out into the night. But even then, we weren't safe. Not really. We burst out into the cold night air, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. The oppressive weight of the bunker's darkness lifted, but the chill in my bones stayed. The world outside felt wrong, too still, too quiet. The fog had thickened while we were inside, curling around the trees like skeletal fingers. We didn't speak. Not at first. We just kept moving, tripping over roots and rocks as we pushed through the overgrown path. I think we all thought the same thing. If we stopped, if we hesitated for even a moment, something might pull us back in. It wasn't until we reached the edge of the swamp, where the path widened and the twisted trees thinned, that we realized Danny wasn't with us. "He's still in there," Mia said, her voice hollow. I turned back toward the base, barely visible through the fog. The massive structure loomed like a shadow against the sky, its windows dark, its doors nothing more than gaping voids. And then I saw it. In the doorway, framed by the faint glow of our flashlights, was the figure. It was just standing there, motionless, its form barely more than a silhouette against the darkness. But I knew it was watching us. Even from this distance, I could feel its gaze, cold and invasive, like it was reaching into my mind. Before I could say anything, the door slammed shut. The sound echoed through the swamp, louder than it should have been, like the earth itself was recoiling. We stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at that door, waiting for something. But nothing happened. "We have to go back for him," Will said finally, his voice breaking. "No," Maya said sharply. Her eyes were wide, her face pale. "You saw it. He's gone." I can't just leave him, Will snapped, but his voice lacked conviction. It's not him, Mia whispered, her hands trembling. I don't know why, but I believed her. Something deep inside me, something primal, told me she was right. Whatever was in that base, it wasn't Danny anymore. We staggered back to the car, our silence heavy with the weight of what we'd seen, of what we'd lost. The drive back was a blur. None of us spoke. None of us looked at each other. The screeching sound still echoed faintly in my ears, and I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that shadowy figure following us. The search for Danny lasted 3 days. Police, search and rescue teams, even a few locals joined in. But they found nothing. No footprints, no belongings, no sign that he'd ever left the base. When they questioned us, we told them the truth. Well, most of it. We told them about the bunker, the diary, the experiments. But we didn't mention the figure. Not the shadow, not the voice, not the way the walls seemed to breathe around us. I think part of me hoped that if I didn't say it out loud, it wouldn't be real. But it was. Weeks passed and I tried to move on, tried to convince myself that it was over. But it wasn't. It started with the dreams. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, the sound of that screech ringing in my ears. In the dreams, I was back in the bunker, standing before the sealed door. I'd hear Danny's voice, faint and distorted, calling to me from the other side. And then slowly, the dream started to bleed into reality. I'd hear his voice in the dead of night, faint and far away. I'm here, it would say. Come back. Sometimes, when I was alone, I'd feel it. A presence, cold and unrelenting, standing just behind me. I'd turn around, my heart pounding, but there'd be nothing there. Nothing but shadows that seemed to shift just out of sight. The worst part is, I can't escape it. Not really. I've moved 3 times since that night, trying to outrun whatever followed me out of that place. But no matter where I go, it finds me. Just last week, I was sitting in my living room, staring at the blank screen of my TV, trying to ignore the feeling that something was watching me. And then, for just a moment, I saw it. A shadow flickered across the screen, tall and wrong, its form blurring at the edges like it wasn't entirely real. I know what you're thinking. I wouldn't believe me either if I hadn't lived it, but I have. And sometimes late at night, when the world is quiet and the shadows are long, I still hear Danny's voice. Come back, he says, and I wonder, if I do, will it finally end? Or is this just the beginning? That's my story, or at least as much of it as I can bear to share. Even now, I'm not sure I fully understand what happened that night in the base. Was it all in our heads, the product of fear and suggestion? Or was there something truly there, something waiting in the darkness? And Danny, is he still in that place? Is he trapped, calling out to us even now? Or was it never really Danny at all? I've spent countless nights replaying it in my mind, searching for answers. But the truth is, I don't think I'll ever know. What do you think? Have you ever ventured into a place like this? A place where the air feels heavy, the shadows seem alive, and reality itself begins to twist? If you have, I want to hear about it. Share your story in the comments below. Tell me, what would you have done in my shoes? Would you have gone back for him? Or would you have run like we did, knowing that some doors should never be opened? And if this story made you feel even a fraction of the fear we felt that night, then please like this video and subscribe to the channel. I have more stories to share. True horror stories that linger in the back of your mind long after the screen goes dark. But for now, I'll leave you with this. Listen closely. If one day you find yourself alone in the dark and you hear a voice calling your name, a voice you recognize but can't quite place, ask yourself this: is it someone you know, or is it something else? Because sometimes the things that haunt us don't just live in the past. Sometimes they follow. So now I leave it to you. Have you ever felt it? That creeping sensation like a cold breath on the back of your neck, even when you're alone? The feeling that someone is watching you, just beyond the edge of your vision, in the shadows where the light doesn't quite reach? What would you have done if you were there that night? If you had felt the walls closing in, heard the whispers, seen the shadows move? Would you have gone back for Danny? Would you have stayed to uncover the truth, no matter the cost? Or would you have run as we did, knowing that some things are better left undisturbed? I want to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments, your theories, your experiences. Tell me, what's the scariest place you've ever been? Do you believe places like that abandoned base hold more than just echoes of the past? And if this story kept you on the edge of your seat, if it made your heart race or sent a shiver down your spine, then do me a favor. Hit that like button. It's one small action that lets me know you want more stories like this. But don't stop there. Subscribe to the channel for more chilling tales, stories of the unexplained, of the unknown, and of the unforgettable. And turn on notifications so you never miss a new upload. Because I promise there are more stories to tell. Stories that will make you question what you think you know about the world around you and what might be lurking in the dark corners you avoid. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and remember, sometimes it's not just your imagination. Sometimes it's real.